Hello friends, Reckless Tempest here, top 16 Seasonals player. Let's start off our meta report with the 10 most played archetypes on ladder. Number 1, we have Kai'Sa at 15%, pretty much like last week, I guess up 1% in a bit. Number 2 though, really interesting, is Powder Monkeys, Powder Pandemonium, currently playing Teemo and Twisted Fate as its two main champions, but you can actually just swap in and out champions and regions pretty liberally, since the key card is Powder Pandemonium and Triggering Plunder. These champions are just like really good at doing it. Also, if you want to watch some gameplay, I do have a video of that. Might be up now or in the description. Third up, we have Bartolai, Tentacle Smash, 6.4%. It's obviously retracing pretty big, down close to half. Rawls has made a big comeback in the metagame, up to 5%, 5.5% of play. And just to spoil like the matchup stuff, it's basically because even though it doesn't beat Kai'Sa, it has a very good win rate against most of the other decks in the metagame. Jhin Annie, up a percent, 20-ish% relatively speaking, not bad. Sivir Kai'Sa has lost a lot of ground, now it's like really low, but still if you add together the Kai'Sa decks, we're getting close to 20% of the meta. Azir Aurelia is going down, TF Annie actually going down a good amount too, Heimerdinger Jace, same thing, and Katarina TF seems to be taking some of Annie TF's stake in the metagame. Oh yeah, also the link to this article is in the description. I highly recommend you check it out. Cool matchup table here. I'm not really going to go that in depth on it, just because there is a metric ton of information here, and this is really complicated. So, but if you want to check it out, check the link. And now we're going to go over the power score of the decks. And the power score is basically a score a deck has when you take its win rates against everything on ladder, and then you weigh the win rates based on how often the other decks appear, and whichever deck has the highest score essentially means this is the best deck to climb ladder with. And surprisingly, Thrall's is number 1. It has a very high power score of 100 max. And this is again because it beats up on a lot of the other decks that aren't Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa has fallen to number 2 at 85, which is still like very climbable. We have the second Kai'Sa deck also here at 85. Alawi Bard still, holding on. Yeah, then we have Jhin Annie, TF Annie, and now this is kind of where it starts getting a little loose. Obviously, you can always win with playing well and getting good matchups and all that stuff, but at about this point, I start getting a little like I don't know if I necessarily want to climb outside of like the lower part of a league. TF Teemo actually has a pretty low power score, and I think this is kind of expected. I tried the deck out, and I wasn't particularly impressed with it. Like, it does some things. You can win some games, but you can lose a lot really easily. Yeah, and the meta score is basically, it's a modified power score, but it's essentially within the top 10 decks. And who do we have here? Kai'Sa is still number 1. Yeah, and I think this is just because people, on average in card games, they never really pick the decks they should be grinding ladder with. Not everyone's trying to maximize their win rate, right? So normally the top power score is going to be kind of different from the meta score, whereas the meta score is like a very restricted view of a deck's power. Now let's go over some of the deck codes of the top decks based off their win rates. Basically, I use the deck code checker and the featured deck list thing to find, very high win rate decks, but also ones that had a high amount of games played. I think something got reset with the ladder of the tracking today because the total number of games isn't very high, but here we have Mono Kai'Sa, very similar to last week, 3 Cataclysms, 3 Rites of Callings, which essentially gives you 6 Kai'Sas, ton of evolved creatures. Again, we're still playing Hatchling and Voidling to have double keywords. Not a whole lot of iteration has happened with this deck. I've seen a few lists play Void Abomination, but I don't think you particularly need it, but if the metagame trends in different directions, you can always put them back in. Here's Powder Monkey, the big deck of the metagame, the new hotness. And basically this deck works by trying to trigger Plunder as much as possible, and you play Powder Pandemonium, which gives you a metric ton of Powder Monkeys, and then you get to burn out your opponent. So essentially this is kind of like a more kooky, more variance heavy burn deck than say a Noxus, Legion Saboteur, Noxian Fervor deck. This deck can kind of like just fizzle out and dud, but also if it curves pretty well and you draw Powder Pandemonium, it can do some disgusting things. Alawi Bard hasn't really changed too much. The only kind of neat thing I've seen is I think one list and what two Yibin Warned is relatively stocked now. And I just saw some variation between the second blood and the water being one cosmic binding, so yeah, you can do that if you want. Wells is looking pretty similar compared to how it normally does. You might want to run two avalanches on ladder. I picked this list because obviously the highest winning list was Cameron Hanzo's, but he only had two Inquisitor, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but obviously he's really good with Wells, so maybe you should just take that code. But I prefer having three just to make sure I can actually do the Thralls thing as consistently as possible. But besides that, there's nothing too kooky here. Like, we've seen one Preservarium before. We've seen one Buried in Ice back in the past. Sands of Time is pretty nutty. The nerf isn't really that relevant, but it's something. Two Red Negations. Yeah, I think if you play Thralls in best of 3, though, odds are aggro is not going to be in a great spot come seasonals or best of 3 gauntlets, so you can always shave avalanches, and that's what I did for seasonals last time. Now we have Janani. Pretty much this deck list hasn't really changed much. I've seen some people wiggle in a few different cards. I saw one list play some Blade's Edges, but they're all pretty similar. Like, you have a pretty narrow set of actually viable cards, and there's about like 6 cards total, not 6 different cards that you can kind of weasel around. Looking at Sever Kaisa, we actually have some pretty sweet hotness with 3 Void Abominations. I freaking love this card, and I'm actually looking forward to playing it. I'm assuming Kaisa is going to get nerfed in a week, and then I'll get to play Void Abomination, and it'll be the correct pick. But until then, I'm putting this on the shelf, and I'm waiting. I'm waiting. But besides that, there's honestly not a whole lot of a difference between this and Mono Kaisa. Just a slightly lower power score. Like, now it's actually very marginal, the difference between them in power levels. So if you want to kind of pre-prep for the Kaisa nerf, this might actually be a fine deck list to play, just because this is probably, if Kaisa's playable after the nerfs, this is probably more in the realm of what's actually going to be viable, as opposed to Mono Kaisa. I had to choose between two Azera Relia lists. Basically, the only difference was one had Greenglade Duo and one had Field Musicians. And I think one had like one more bounce spell than the other. But all in all, these shells are more or less the same. High number of 1-drops, Domination, Blossoming Blades, 6 champs, usually 1 Rite of Calling because your champs are so important. Nothing too unique here. Moving on to NETF, not a whole lot to my non-NETF eyes has really shifted. I've seen some people play some Scorched Earths. Some people, I think, play up to 6 Stratus, which seems a little degenerate to me. But all in all, this archetype's been hodling pretty good, right? It's just a nice combination of card advantage and burn and interaction. Definitely not a Heimerdinger Jace expert, so I can't really notice any of the subtle shifts in this archetype that well, except Adaptatron 3000 doesn't seem to be pretty common anymore. I don't even know if it ever was. I just remember getting my head stomped a few times by it. And lastly, we have Katarina TF. I actually think this is kind of interesting. Some people like Majin Bay and a few other players seem to like Katarina more than Annie, just because Annie kind of doesn't necessarily do a whole lot by herself besides throw a few points of damage, and she generates a 6-drop. Whereas Katarina actually lets you turn the corner and get very, very aggressive, which is something I'm a fan of normally too. But it lets this mid-range deck turn the corner quickly when it gains the advantage, which I think is actually kind of important, as opposed to just like dirtling the game out and potentially letting your opponent get back into it by drawing, a very sweet combination of cards, or maybe they're like, they have a stronger late game than you, and if you don't slam the door on them quickly, they get to do the thing. If you want to see more ranked games from this season, like some of the video things over here, we got Powder Monkey Pandemonium. I also have a Baint Gauntlet lineup that you might be interested in, and if you want more Runeterra goodness, decimate that subscribe button. See you next week.